Lesson 11, the New Republic. We'd seen in Lesson 10 how the Constitution was established as the machinery of government for the United States, which we've used and carried on with 27, 28 odd amendments through ever since. But to get that machinery actually rolling is in many ways the topic of our first chapter, or our first lesson here on this new nation with the new governing model being the Constitution. At the time it was untried, at the time it was very new. At the time the founders who were involved and the framers involved in writing that document thought that it would last maybe 20 or 30 years. And so we began then with the new emergence of a new branch of government that the previous government did not have, which was an executive branch. The office of president was almost exclusively built with Washington in mind. Very few times in history has an office been created where they had the guy before they actually had the position. This is one of those instances. And Washington was very aware upon his ascending to the presidency. He's the only man who ever got a unanimous vote in the Electoral College. All the electors voted for him. Nobody else has before, or nobody else has since. But he was very aware that upon walking into the executive mansion and assuming the office of president, he said, I'm walking on untrodden ground. In other words, he knew that once the Constitution quit being a legal document and started to actually become a working, operating government, that he, through the executive branch, in many ways was going to set the precedents that all other future presidents would look to in terms of how do you do this? How do you carry out this job? How do things transpire and take place? What's the day-to-day operations look like? And Washington begins by, first of all, establishing something the Constitution never called for. He establishes the cabinet. The original cabinet had four positions in it: Vice President John Adams, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. These were advisors who were going to essentially help Washington with his decisions in many ways for these sub-departments of the government. Very rapidly, the two key individuals within this cabinet become Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who represent opposite ends of the political spectrum of this first American party system. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, has a vision for the United States. If Hamilton was going to look at his crystal ball and look at America in the future and say, what's this nation of the future going to look like in the future, he would have seen very much the nation that you live in today. A nation of commerce, a nation of finance, a nation of business and industry in the free market, a nation of large urban areas and vast productive capacity and great economic potential. In fact, his most famous quote on this is he said the United States was like Hercules in a cradle at the point where they were at now. He felt that it was the job of government as a federalist to help aid this Hercules move beyond the cradle and take its first steps toward fulfilling this vibrant economic destiny this nation could fulfill. As such, he worked in an activist sense within the government to strengthen the power of the federal government as a tool for aiding business, commerce, and trade, because that's what Hamilton and all Federalists saw as being the central purpose of the government, because a strong economy would make for a strong nation, and it would make for a nation that life under the Articles of Confederation did not provide. You take that self-interest and apply it towards a positive national type goal, and you can get an awful lot done. That was the logic and reasoning. So he has two key reports that he sends in to Washington for advice on what ought to be done and how it ought to be done. The first is his report on the manufacturers. In his report on manufacturers, he calls for a protective tariff. Now, a tariff is an AP word. It's a tax on imported goods. There's essentially two reasons why you would ever put a tax on anything as a government. One reason is to raise revenue. The other reason is to perhaps protect your home industries. And the way it works is if you say you tax automobiles, and any foreign-made automobile coming into the country automatically has a $5,000 per vehicle tax on it, payable by the consumer at the point of purchase, that car made in the United States just became a lot better financial buy. So you can use tariff policy to steer people's decisions towards purchases you want them to make. And Hamilton thought issue number one was to strengthen the American economy and strengthen American industry, and the tariff was a lever he could use to do this. He also submits a report on bank and credit, and he thinks it's very important that the United States pay off its war debts, both its debts to foreign country and the war bonds that were sold to private Americans. They should be paid off in full, because to establish that good credit rating, he says, is the way that the nation will get a firm economic footing and a firm political footing, be taken seriously by the other nations around the world, because it can meet its obligations. Part of this system of debt assumption involved the establishment of a bank in the United States, a central bank bank, which the Constitution said nothing about. And this is where Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, gets into a major philosophical disagreement with Hamilton and an open disagreement within Washington's cabinet meetings. And the issue is this: Jefferson is a strict constructionist. Jefferson is not a Federalist. Jefferson is going to be part of what we're going to call the Democratic Republican worldview, which was the sort of anti-constitutional or limited constitutional worldview. The view of the anti-Federalists, remember what it was: government should not get involved in the economy. It should not pick winners and losers in the economy. The government power at the national level should be severely curtailed to only what's explicitly in the Constitution. This was so-called strict construction. Since nowhere in the Constitution did it mention that the executive branch has the power on behalf of the federal government to establish a national bank, Jefferson says this is dangerous. This is encroaching power of federal government by degrees that could make that government larger and more powerful and larger and larger and larger as you head down this slippery slope to the point where you would then have this massive, very muscular federal government. And Jefferson said, that's the whole thing we fought against. And so you have to stop it before it begins. So there cannot be a national bank. Jefferson and Hamilton go back and forth on the philosophical ideas of this, why there ought to or not be one, which tied into Lesson 10 a great deal. And Washington then sits and listens. And Washington's ultimate decision is to go forward with legislation for the creation of a national bank because he is persuaded by Hamilton that use of a particular part of the Constitution is warranted in this instance. And this is the use of the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, the so-called elastic clause. And this might help you. Call it an elastic clause because it's stretchy. What can you do? It's the part of the Constitution that says in so many words, the United States federal government has the power to do anything that's necessary and proper to help it carry out its prescribed specific roles of governance as the Constitution states them. So it allows the government to stretch its powers to cover things that the Constitution never described, like space travel, air travel, cable television and communications regulations, etc. None of those things existed in 1789 or in 1787 during the constitutional debates. Our federal government, through the elastic clause, has powers to regulate and manage and monitor those because they're seen as necessary and proper roles for that federal government. Hamilton persuades Washington of the necessity of a bank for this purpose. And the banking system and the financial system he sets up winds up proving dividends. It winds up working to get our debt paid down and reduced and get the nation back onto that stable financial footing. In terms of foreign policy, the dilemmas of the French Revolution confront the United States with some unexpected political and military issues that couldn't be ignored. In 1789, the French overthrow their king, the same king and the same government that helped the United States during our revolution. Now, because of the Franco-American Alliance of 1778, the treaty where the French allied with us during the Revolutionary War after the Battle of Saratoga, each side was pledged to the mutual defense of the other side if they were ever threatened. Well, the rest of the nations in Europe, gets us into world history a little bit, the rest of the nations in Europe were all run by monarchies, absolute monarchies at that. They didn't like the idea of the French Revolution, which rapidly spiraled into the bloodbath of the Reign of Terror, where the former king is deposed and then murdered, his entire family is murdered, and then the French go on a binge of the Reign of Terror being this genocidal war against the noble classes. The other nations of Europe take a look at this, their governments take a look at this, and they say, if this works, if this revolution works, and these classes are purged, and France turns into this happy, vibrant, democratic republic where the common man rules, all the ruling classes of these other nations in Europe say that's going to be bad for us, because our people are going to want that too. As such, the nations of Europe began to gang up on the French to try to stop this republic, to try to reinstate a royal monarchy within the nation. So in a twist that was never expected, it was always presumed that the United States would be the weaker nation needing France's help in this alliance treaty. The French actually call on the Americans to invoke the alliance treaty to join with them in common cause as a fellow republic, a fellow democratic republic, to wage war against all these continental nations. Remember the word realpolitik, where a nation ruthlessly pursues foreign policy based on its own self-interests. George Washington, the new president of this new republic, which is in a fragile, formulative state with a weak economy, minimal military, just getting off the ground, Washington sees it as not being in American self-interest to engage in this sort of European struggle, because he says nothing good can come from that for us. So He doesn't break the alliance treaty. What he actually does is he argues that we signed that treaty, the United States signed that treaty with the government of France. Not the nation of France, but the government of France. When the French killed their monarch, when they deposed that government, that invalidated the treaty as well, because our treaty was the French nation state, not the French nation. As such, we're out of the treaty, we don't have to get involved, and we're going to declare a policy of neutrality. We're going to stay out of this conflict. The French people, of course, are livid about this, but there's very little they can do about it. You can't make somebody come into a war with you that's a continent away. So they do the best they can, and after Washington's Neutrality Proclamation, they try to go around Washington and stir up the American people to get involved, to arm privateer ships, to attack British ships, and try to drag us into war by proxy. Citizen Genet, as you may recall from your history classes, is sent here from France for this purpose, to try to stir up the American public. Washington calls into account and essentially says, I need to throw you out of the country unless you quit trying to go over my head and go to the American people and get us into this conflict that the government has said we're not going to get into. This is very different. This is a pronounced difference from life under the Articles of Confederation, where there was no established head of state, no executive branch to make this decision, to speak for the state in this way. And so it establishes some of the power of the executive branch as speaking for the nations, and the president he establishes, and Genet backs down. So this is realpolitik revisited.